Well, our first speaker this morning, as I said to him, I know you, I've seen you on TV. Iain Rennie is in his second term as State Services Commissioner and Head of State Services. Initially appointed back in 2008, and he did such a good job, they gave him another round. Iain's role is to provide leadership and oversight of the State Services with the objective of creating a culture of excellence and efficiency, stewardship and maintaining high standards of integrity and conduct, which of course is incredibly important within our public service. On a topic never far from the headlines, that of state service reform, please welcome State Services Commissioner Iain Rennie.
Kia ora. Thank you, Susan. Good morning, everyone. What I'd like to do this morning is to talk a little bit about where is the state sector travelling, and I suppose the key point I want to make to you as key users, producers of data, information, statistics, at the heart of the transformation of the state sector that's underway. We will succeed or fail in part about how we marshal and use information. So all of you here are really important, no pressure. And secondly, the key point, I think, about one of the really big shifts, if we're to be successful as a state sector, is the sense of stewardship. That actually, by taking a collective responsibility for how the state sector works, we're going to be best positioned to deliver excellent results for New Zealanders. And that's a responsibility that sits with us. It sits with particular people as leaders in the system. But the key issue, it's something that we shouldn't wait around for permission from ministers, because it's fundamentally our job. So I wanted just to expand on that, about at the heart of state sector reform is the idea about driving better results for citizens and business. Fundamentally, state sector reform is not wholly about just, tinkering with the machine or merging agencies or splitting agencies about. It's trying to think about how do we shift the dial around critical issues for New Zealanders. Now, overall, we do a pretty good job in New Zealand. We're well trusted. International surveys, show we're pretty much a corruption-free public service. We're well regarded. But we live in a country where we've got some really big issues as a community that we have struggled to make consistent progress on over the last 20 or 30 years. I remember when I was a young public servant, we talked about the long tail of underachievement in education, and despite the fact I think we've wrestled a bit with that, we haven't cracked it. And so the idea about being clear about the priority results that we're trying to drive for citizens is fundamental to where we're going for a state sector. And we see that in part with the government's 10 result areas for the public service, but they are examples of a broad approach that we should be using. But if we take those 10 result areas, I think it's really interesting about the way in which information and data is both helping us get solutions, but to engage with other public servants and, importantly, the community around those issues. One of the things that's really struck me about the 10 result areas is that they are helping us change the conversation with communities. So that I look at the justice sector, for example, and the fact that we've put up there in big red lights, we need to actually improve our ability to take people in our correctional system and rehabilitate them so that they can go back into communities and don't come back into the correction system, has led to a very different conversation with a whole set of groups in the community. And actually, the good news is we're making some really good progress on that result. But the point about information on that is that it is critical both to people working in the system to generate those results, to know how they're going, to have a think about what's working, what's not, how do we change things. And I see that when I go around and talk to public servants who are engaged in the results area. I was up a few months ago in Upper Hutt, and the justice sector there have been working very closely together about trying to actually address the issues of crime in their community. And they're actually using all kinds of different information, some very local, almost very tacit, through to very hard data, into official information. And as a group of officials, they're actually meeting regularly, they're tracking their performance, they're trying to work out what is working, what's not, what do we need to change, what do we need to keep. So for us to deliver on a results approach, I think we're going to see a real renaissance in the state services about how state servants need information, because we're in a world where if we're going to drive different results for communities and individuals, we're not going to do it through big, broad brush policy changes. It's the gritty, hard business of knowing communities, of knowing how policies interact with each other, how they actually play out in practice. And that will require all kinds of different kinds of evidence for us to make judgments about how we work differently. I went up to Auckland a few months ago and met with a group of senior public service leaders in Auckland, and one thing they were crying out for was give us a dashboard across the 10 result areas so we can see in Auckland how we're going as a big region and how we can take responsibility across the result areas. So I'm really pleased to say that Cabinet's agreed to start making available those kind of regional dashboards. So you get the sense of, within the service, the centrality about being clear what is the information we need to use, how we use different parts of information together. And increasingly, I think it's an issue about how we share that information for the community, because we don't have all the solutions. Some of the areas that actually we're struggling with in the results area, like, for example, reducing the awful incidence of rheumatic fever that we have in this country, to be very honest, we don't have the solutions. We're grappling in a very serious way to find those solutions, but in trying to actually get the community onto a different track, we will increasingly need to share information, share data with the community, so that they, as much as us, can be part of the solution and part of the journey to making the state sector work a lot better. I think when you look at some of the agencies that are using information and data much more intensely, I look at the Ministry of Social Development and some of the really exciting things that you see on the front line as they are in the context of the investment approach to reduce the number of long-term beneficiaries, the amount of energy, of insight that is coming out from understanding performance, having that reflected back into the business, having that reflected back into underlying policy settings. The use of information is critical. The second part of the approach to state sector reform is the idea of leadership. That actually, if we're thinking about seriously driving some priority results for citizens, we need to mobilise the key assets of the state to help produce those results. And there are broadly three kind of key assets for the state. Money, people, the people who work in the state services, and information. And over the last year or so, in the context of better public services, we've sought to clarify the leadership responsibilities and accountabilities for leaders about helping to marshal and mobilise those key assets. So you'll hear shortly from Colin, who in his role as the GCIO has a critical role around helping the system mobilise itself around information, and in doing that in a secure way and an effective way. And there are other leaders who are similarly picking up the baton Liz's role as government statistician has a critical system leadership role around the official statistics system. And I'm really pleased at the way in which statistics has been stepping up around that leadership role in the last few years. If you look at the area of geospatial information, which has a huge ability to generate quite different outcomes, particularly for local communities. Again, the role that Land Information New Zealand, the role that Peter Mersey is taking, working with other colleagues in that space, is symptomatic about, I think, increasingly individual leaders taking responsibility to help mobilise parts of the system so that actually we use these assets not just in the way that we've always done it to inform the jobs that we do day to day in our agencies, but to think about the capacity to mobilise different sets of information to give us insight into problems in a new way. And I can just see that whole energy around that initiative is going to change. The Analytics for Outcomes team that's housed in the Treasury is a really interesting case about how we're trying to build capability in the system to think about using administrative data to generate those kinds of outcomes. So, leadership, I think, is critical in this space, and particularly around information. The final comment I'd make is this issue about stewardship. Because we're working in a complex system, we can't reform the state sector in fits and starts because our communities are changing. The communities are changing actually quite rapidly. We can't always wait around for ministers to get interested in reforming the state sector because actually there don't tend to be lots of votes in reforming the state sector compared to getting votes on other issues. So the responsibility has to lie with us. I went to Australia last week to visit a number of jurisdictions, and I went to Canberra, and I found it a really depressing experience, which is not Canberra. I usually find going to Canberra a depressing experience. But the thing that struck me in talking to senior leaders in Canberra was how much they thought about public sector reform as having to come from above, a mandate having to come from above. So you're sort of waiting for the tablets of stone, and at the moment they don't think there'll be any tablets of stone or tablets anyway coming anytime soon from their political masters. And there's a real cost for that in us. That's why I think the idea about stewardship is so fundamentally important, because we're going to have to, if we're trying to drive those results for citizens, we're going to have to continually kind of adapt. We're going to have to try things, evaluate how well they've worked, adapt in the light of experience. So the sense of stewardship, that view to the long term, is really, I think, fundamental to successfully, having a truly world-class, state sector where we are taking ownership around a lot of that fundamental infrastructure that will have to deliver to New Zealanders regardless of the government of the day. And so one of the really important changes for me in the state sector legislation that passed last year was the explicit responsibilities for chief executives about stewardship around their people capability, stewardship around the assets that they administer, and that includes information. And for me, it's really fundamental that we begin to take the long view to how we think about developing information sets that are going to drive performance over 10 and 20 and 30 years. And those things take time, and that's why the idea about stewardship is fundamental, and why gatherings like this are really important, that we actually do try to understand what are the issues that are coming up for our communities. How do we then prepare ourselves to be able to anticipate those issues and meet those pressures when we face them. So in summary, I actually think this is a really exciting time to be a public servant. I think it's a really exciting time for public servants who work in the business of information, managing knowledge, because, as I said at the start, fundamentally, if the name of the game, which it is to deliver better results for New Zealanders, that is going to derive a lot about our collective ability to use, to share, to collate, to integrate information for the people that we serve. And I think that's a really inspiring purpose, and I look forward to working with you all in pursuit of that. Thank you.